Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Bill. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here in this lovely city again. And I want to touch on some of the points that have been made. I've got a presentation, but I want to try and link in with what you've said, Bill, and some of what has been said yesterday. One thing that we haven't spoken about so far is ethics, business ethics. We have to accept that institutions are not made by external regulators. They are made by human beings. And we have seen a lot of new rules being written in the Western world following the financial crisis in the belief that institutions can be reshaped by those rules. I know very well, having worked in the financial system, many of my clients were very well paid to get around the rules. Their motives were not aligned with the rules because the rules assumed a kind of morality which doesn't match very well with personal greed. And I also know that when we recruited people into our firm...
Sorry, Tarek, just a second. Can you hear Tarek at the back? Is it...
Does it need to be louder?
You may need to approach maybe the microphone a little bit more. Yeah.
When we recruited people into our firm, and I know from law firms, accountancy firms, banks in London who I speak to closely, when they recruit, they look at a CV which has A grades and first-class honours, and they perhaps have made the assumption that good grades means that you're hiring a good, ethical person with a strong moral compass. That assumption is not correct. The brain is the engine of the human being, but the heart is the steering wheel. And we have to find a way of looking at this steering wheel, because a powerful engine without a steering wheel will create a disaster. So we need to think about recruitment processes in order to build our institutions, and we need to think then about our education system. Is business ethics, morality being taught? Is it being tested at the recruitment stage? Because there's no use having these 1,000 pages of extra rules if the people in the institutions don't agree with the rules or don't want to follow them. So we ask some questions in the Islamic theology about what is our purpose, and that really follows on from this. If you have somebody who believes that maximizing profit is his purpose, there's a very different set of motives compared to somebody who believes that worshipping Allah and achieving paradise in the next life is his purpose. When I went into Islamic finance, many people from the secular world argued that Islam should have nothing to do with finance. It should have nothing to do with the science of finance. And religion should keep away from finance. And I often tell people that capitalism is a religion of its own. And we've accepted that religion. So now it's a question of which religion will you choose. Capitalism's religion tells you to maximize profit. Islam tells you to maximize good deeds. Both value judgments. So it's not a question of whether religion should interfere in the way we think. It's a question of which religion are you going to choose. And this then permeates down through many other factors, such as our measurement units. How do we measure success? We're talking about setting up financial institutions and institutional framework. What is our measure of success? Is it the monetary unit? Are we going to look at the balance sheets of companies or the balance sheet of the government and say, oh, we've been successful, look, profits higher, budget deficits lower? Is that how we measure it? Because if our measurement unit is wrong, then our policy response will be wrong. What about happiness? What about pollution? What about divorce rates? Do we measure any of these things? Is it the case that a monetarily poor country in which the people are happy, is that country less successful than a monetarily rich country in which the people are very unhappy? These are all value judgments, but we need to have that discussion. Do we have the right tools to measure what we're doing? Do we have the right purpose? So enough of that. Let's have a look at some of the... you can have motives, you can have internal regulation from the heart and external regulation, and we need all of this. we need contractual rules as well. And having thought about things for a little while, I have a little chart that reminds us that a successful economy does need wealth creation. We need to find a way of creating wealth. Maybe not maximizing wealth, but we need to have an economy in which our framework and our products help us to create wealth. We consume our food, our clothes, and our machines wear out. We need to replace them. We need to continually create wealth. And so in this chart, you have wealth creation in one column, and we have wealth transfer in another column. A way of acquiring wealth is by creating it and getting paid for it. Trade, investment partnership, waged labor, all ways of creating wealth for personal gain. You get paid, you get a share of profits. So that's the top left-hand box. We can transfer wealth. We can give gifts. We can give endowments. We can make interest-free loans. They are charitable wealth transfer transactions. And these, if they're done not for personal gain, if they're done fi sabilillah, for the sake of Allah, they're permitted in Islam. And we can do wealth creation not for personal gain. We can teach our kids, look after our parents, do community work. We're creating wealth there. We have to accept that. And all of these things are permitted, and they have to be encouraged. But the Islamic rules of transactions prohibit what we have in the top right-hand box, wealth transfer for personal gain. This, you can see many rules in Sharia are aimed at prohibiting this. And theft is one example. So is gambling, so is usury, so is debasement of the money supply. These are all mechanisms which transfer wealth from one group of people to another for personal gain. Okay? And when you look at Sharia, it's focusing on these, it's prohibitions-based. We have not really discussed in the Islamic banking and finance environment the gift economy. It's become very prominent in discussions in Malaysia recently, the gift economy. But if you look at the history of the Western world too, as well as the Muslim world, endowments were a very prominent part of financing economic activity, actually. Hospitals, schools, orphanages. Very prominent was the gift from the rich to the poor through endowments, through sadaqah. With one advantage at least being that the cost of finance is zero, or maybe arguably minus 100%. And we need to give some attention to this. Is zakat being collected and distributed properly? Are we encouraging gift and endowment? Are we managing them properly? Because we can perhaps produce a lot of our financing requirement from these activities. So I'm going to look at interest-bearing loans and debasement for 15 minutes or so, and I want to look at them from a Sharia perspective as well as from a secular perspective. And we're here talking about sustainability largely. I have shown this slide very often over the years because if you have an interest-based economy, one thing that's very common in it is the discounted cash flow technique for analysing projects. And this is a very old example, 20 years old. We have a farmer who has two potential farming techniques to choose from. One is sustainable farming, producing £100 of profit every year, which has been going on for generations in his community. Or we can have highly intensive farming producing £150 of profit every year, but only for 15 years, after which the land turns to desert. Okay? And this is a very real, this is not a hypothetical, this is a real situation which are facing many developing countries in the agricultural sector. If you do a DCF analysis on this using a 10% discount rate, you choose to go for the high intensive production technique. Interest-based financing tools tell you to turn the land into desert. And any tool which tells you to turn your land into desert has to have something wrong with it. Many people have written about this. We saw Frederick Soddy yesterday talking about debt that grows at compound interest while real-world assets rot gradually, compound decrement. And our financial system should match the real world. It shouldn't contradict it. If real wealth cannot grow at compound increment, then neither should our financial instruments. We have to find a way that finance reflects real world, not finance that dominates and forces the real world to behave in a way that's not natural. We also have to recognize that financing costs have now become an enormous part of the total project cost in almost all areas of activity in infrastructure and wealth creation generally. So that, if we have a look at the London skyline, or what tourists go to London to see these days, it's the beautiful buildings of central London, built of stone, brick, marble, with skilled technicians, very good quality architectural devices which make the city what it is. But we're not doing that anymore. I've shown a photograph here of a property near central London, built 3 years ago, out of corrugated plastic. And the reason that this building was built is not that people want to live in a building made of corrugated plastic, but because the total cost of building a home in London now, 3/4 of it goes in interest charges and dividends, and only 1/4 of it goes into the property itself. To buy £1 of value, you have to pay £4, and therefore you can't afford to build a property of good quality materials. And this is the way the world is going to look if we carry on like this. If we pay this huge tax on all our infrastructure projects, we are going to have a poorer world. There is a project in Coventry, or there was a project in Coventry in the United Kingdom to build a hospital, under a private finance initiative just 3 years ago, in which the local managers gave a budget of 30 million to rebuild the existing hospitals to a modern standard. This, unfortunately, didn't happen because the private finance initiative rules in the United Kingdom require bidding through a certain set of contractors using private finance, in other words, bank finance. When they finally finished building the project, it cost 400 million sterling, not 30 million. Because the rates of financing are very high, because they have to use preferred contractors with very high profit rates. You're spending a huge amount of money on the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, but most of it is being sucked away to wealth transfer rather than wealth creation. And so we have to really question how we do finance, because I don't believe we can build or rebuild a world like this. There is also the issue of leverage and monopoly. And again, our financial system has to encourage widespread ownership and public control over the business environment rather than multinational or transnational control. I took this photograph in London a few years back now. It's a large shopping mall just outside London. And the reason I took this photograph, you can see many shops here. There are 11 shops here. I took the photograph because 9 of these shops are owned by the same businessman. It looks like a market, but it's actually a monopoly. And those 9 shops are all selling clothes, I should tell you. So you have people going from one shop to another, checking prices, when in fact they're being very cynically manipulated. I mean, why doesn't it have the same name on all of these shops, since they're controlled by the same holding company? Because perhaps the owners don't want the people to know that they're buying from a monopoly. But how has this happened? It's happened because leverage has become the commonplace technique in the world of finance. We borrow at 5% from the bank, we invest at 10% return on assets through our business. If our clothes shops make 10% return on assets, we'll leverage as much as we can. If we have a close relationship with the bank, we'll borrow the money, we'll buy the independent clothes shops and create a monopoly. And this explains the gradual monopolization of business. Very few organizations control the grocery sector, the meat processing sector, the retail, the media sector in the United States and in Western Europe. Very few. 90% of the United States meat processing industry is in the hands of 4 companies. 80% of the UK grocery market is in the hands of 5 companies. So this whole model of owner-managed businesses is disappearing through leverage. And is that the kind of society we want to create? We have to ask that question. So let me not carry on with that too much. We'll have a look at some alternatives for finance. And again, it's a very rather old slide now showing a debt-free home financing scheme. Now we're getting away from debt and fixed interest or interest-like charges on debt. And we're showing a genuine partnership model here, which we've implemented in the United Kingdom to help people buy a home without being in debt. So here you see the home buyer and the finance company become partners in owning a house. And these partners, as they own the house, they share the capital risk of the property. Okay, there's no debt here. The home buyer does not owe 80,000 sterling to the finance company. The finance company has an 80% share in the house. The home buyer has a 20% share. This is how it starts. Over time, the home buyer can buy the share of the home finance company if he wants to, but he doesn't have to. There's no required schedule of repayments. There's no debt. There's no compulsion. In the meantime, the home buyer rents the portion of the house that he doesn't own. Okay? And he can continue like this. If he wants, to the end of the contract, after 10 years, we sell the house, we split the proceeds 80-20. But if the home buyer wants to buy the house, he can. If he has enough money, he can. Okay? And that when he buys, he's paying the market value. So it's a market-based scheme, no debt, no interest, genuine partnership, and everybody sleeps well at night. And I have tried to promote this in the United Kingdom for many years and in many countries. Banks don't want to touch it because we have this institutional framework in which banks cannot take capital risk on their balance sheet, or they don't want to take it at contract stage. And since banks provide the majority of the finance for an economy, and particularly in home finance, we don't find this being offered by any banks anywhere in the world. So the institutional framework which requires capital certainty on the bank balance sheet affects the way that our Islamic finance instruments have developed. Yeah? And if we changed that structure, and I'll come back to this in a couple of minutes, then we would have completely changed the product range. Yeah? Let's have a look at some other ideas. In Toll Road Build, Operate, Transfer, another scheme which I've designed and promoted, we have a toll road, we want to build it, okay, we'll employ a contractor, we'll sign a turnkey delivery project with him, we set up an SPV, we fund the SPV through the issuance of Islamic bonds, okay, fine. Toll roads are used by road users, they pay tolls, the SPV gets its income from the tolls, it has a concession period, at the end of the concession period it can transfer the title to the sponsor, that would be the government. Again, there's no debt here, it's a concession period. The income stream is passed through to the sukuk holders. The income stream is the toll roads minus operating costs. The operator has a profitable contract, therefore. And the sukuk holders have to take the risk that we won't have many people travelling on the road. Okay? If the road fails, the sukuk holders don't get a good return. Okay? That's investment. That's true partnership. I share the risks and the rewards of the project. Slight variation only, and now we have capital leasing. An SPV buys the equipment, rents it to a client, and the sukuk holders again share the capital risk of the equipment because at the end of the lease period the equipment is sold into the market and we get its second-hand value. What we are doing here is we're not, if you like, this transaction at the end, what Islamic banking is doing here is setting a price in advance for the sale or transfer of the asset. This is the typical Islamic banking technique through use of a promise or some other mechanism which effectively turns this operating lease into a finance lease. And as you probably know, traditional Sharia has accepted operating leases, whereas financing leases are a little bit more controversial, very controversial in some instances, because they fix the financial rate of return at the beginning of the contract period for the financial institution. And what we need to do is find a way of shifting this risk on the residual value here to the investors. If we do that, we've got genuine risk sharing, and they can make a genuine resource allocation choice then. Otherwise, if we are fixing the return in advance, this becomes a credit instrument, except in some very rare cases, as Rafi mentioned yesterday, where recourse is only to the project asset, but in more than 90% of Sukuk, this is not the case. So we have this mechanism for genuinely sharing risk. We have exchanges which are quite capable of listing such instruments. This kind of technique can be used in a developed economy. It can be used in microfinance. You have a supplier in a local economy, and you have buyers. We can finance the local supplier by buying equity shares or some similar kind of instrument, and his activity as a local supplier in this developing country will be to sell on installments to clients. The same model, we can securitize it even if we need to. Okay, a bit on money. How much time do I have left now?
About 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me...
Or there is another alternative. We will, let's say 5 minutes, and we won't discuss, but we will open up to the
that's good.
Panel better. Okay.
We've heard a lot being said about the fractional reserve system. Let me just have a look at this quickly from the Sharia point of view. We have this technique, and I'm going back to the early days of deposit banking, where the bank takes a deposit of coins, gold coins, gives out a receipt. Now, for at least 150 years under English law, this receipt was seen as a bailment under English law. It's a warehouse receipt. The gold coins do not belong to the bank. They belong to the depositor. It's a genuine deposit. It will be a wadiyah, okay, under Sharia. In 1858, English law changed, and only in the case of banking, this deposit became seen as a loan to the bank. It was no longer a bailment. Why? The reason is that banks had been using the gold coins and lending them. And people had argued in court in London that the bank had no right to lend those gold coins because the bank did not own them. The gold coins belonged to the depositor, and the bank was merely a safekeeper. But banks were making a very large amount of money from lending the gold coins, and there was a very big institutional pressure to change the law. And therefore today, only in the case of a bank deposit is this seen as a loan. If I put wheat in a warehouse, or copper, or any other commodity, it is seen as a bailment. So the case law 1858, Foley versus Hill in London, gives more details. But of course the banks didn't stop there, because what they did is actually to lend not gold coins, but more paper money. Now in this case, people are using paper as money, and the bank decides to create a further £400 and lend it at interest. We are now in the territory of fraud. This is no longer a question of loan or bailment. This is clear fraud, because the bank has created 500 legal claims of ownership on the same 100 coins. And if we build our entire economic system on an act of fraud at such a basic level as the level of money, then we can't expect to be without serious problems in our economy. Now, I've suggested in Malaysia, I'll skip through a little bit, and I've done this chart of Turkey Consumer Prices Index versus M2, but I think this is quite intuitive. If banks expand the money supply because they can earn more interest, then with more money, we have inflation. The key is to track the change in the rate of money supply expansion against the change in inflation. And if you do that in Turkey, you have a fairly strong correlation. The change in money supply against the change in inflation. If you do it in the UK, the change in lending for home purchase against the change in prices, again, a very strong correlation. So our boom-bust economy is largely determined by our monetary sector, not the real sector. It's not the demand and supply of houses that is the key determinant of house prices in the UK. It's the monetary system. And it goes back to this issue of money creation. So for Malaysia, some years ago, we suggested a way of transforming this system. First of all, Bill, I completely agree, we need buy-in. We need to educate the people because they're going to go through pain. You cannot get rid of a parasite without pain. And the people need to be on the side of whoever makes this reform. So education, number one. Number two, we need to separate the deposit-taking system from the investment system. We have institutions that look after your money as safekeepers and help you transfer payments, and we have institutions who deal with investments, payment transmission, separate to investments. Okay? We establish a state-funded institution of some kind for the transition period to a new monetary system. This state institution will be critical because it will make sure that the transition period is less painful. It will lend where the private institutions stop lending. It may lend on an interest-free basis. It may invest on a profit-sharing basis. We have to adopt protective restrictions on foreign capital movement because it may well be that this kind of reform is undermined from abroad. The Malaysians did this. They were criticized very heavily by Rubin and others, the Treasury Secretary in the States, and by the IMF at the time. But 5 years later, the IMF conceded in writing that the imposition of capital controls in Malaysia was the right thing to do. And they had a very strong leader to push that through. We then increased the government issuance of money. Government issues money. Why should a government borrow money at interest from the banks when the government can create money itself at zero interest? The government creates money at 0% interests and buys off the public debt from the banks. This provides the new reserves which we will use to create or approach a 100% fractional reserve system, okay? A full reserve system, in other words. The new reserves necessary for this system will come from the government that creates the money and injects it into circulation by repurchasing government debt. And that is summarized there. That's the last slide I'll show you. We have the existing system on the left column, bank assets, cash 10, loans to the public sector 50, loans to private sector 40, total assets 100. Bank liabilities, we have the owner's equity, the capital, 10% CAR here, and deposits 90 from the depositing sector. So our balance sheet balances. After this first stage of reform, the government issues sufficient to repurchase all of the public sector debt, 50 of cash. So those loans are taken off the bank balance sheet and they are extinguished. The government has repaid its debt. The 50 moves in to the cash account. So we are already now at a 60% reserve system. Painless, costs nothing, except to the banks who don't have their interest income anymore. That leaves the private debt. This can be resolved by a similar technique, perhaps through the state-funded institution that I mentioned. And if you want to go that far, at the end, you have the third column, the end of the reform process. Now, I'm not saying that this is politically possible. I'm led to believe that it's not politically possible, but we can go some of the way. We can use some of these tactics. We can use some of the financial instruments which we need. We can at least start. And if we can't do that, then let's have the discussion. I've been in this business for 20 years. I have never seen a serious, genuine, open discussion on money. And my message is still the same after 20 years. We cannot have Islamic finance without Islamic money. Thank you.